I just know you're going to love the guests that we have on in this episode, so don't go away. Welcome to the interview. I'm Dr. Rick Wadge, and we have a special guest. I'm in a couple of Bible studies with this man. He is brilliant beyond my expectations, and I think you're going to love him. Scott Baland. Hey.
Great to be here.
It's good to have you here, Scott.
Yeah.
You and I see each other typically a couple of times every Friday.
Yes.
We're in the same kind of studies together, but they're different studies. What's different about those studies? And then let's talk about your journey.
Okay. Well, basically both of the studies are Torah related, but the one that we are in the evenings together is also includes different books of the Old Testament.
Okay.
Besides the Torah.
Why would you say that you have begun to see the importance of studying through the Torah and some of the other books of the Tanakh?
Well, in my case, I just think the two testaments of the Bible are really just one big story. And you can't really understand one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
I've discovered that over the years. I know a lot of people that just really study only the New Testament, and they think that's all that matters. And there's kind of a movement around lately that's kind of going that way again, and out of Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And you may have heard of that, but
Yes.
That's caused a lot of problems with people that are just. It could cause a lot of problems with people who really will believe that. And as far as my journey goes, I began kind of on this new track back in the 80s when I discovered Zola Levitt on TV.
Yes.
And Zola Levitt introduced a Jewish perspective on Christianity. And until that time, I was fairly new in the faith anyway. But I think that caught me just in time to keep me from going too far without that. Because a lot of people don't even ever have that introduction into the Jewish roots. And so they can go their whole life not really understanding the importance. After that introduction in the 80s, I pretty much kind of got back into just a generic evangelical kind of a setup for about 15 to 20 years. And I studied it and it was fine, but beginning at about 2008, I was reintroduced to it by channel surfing on TV. I discovered, some channels that were really talking about Hebrew roots. Mm-hmm. And I just got mesmerized by that. And I just couldn't get enough of it. And once I got into it again, the second go around, I really just couldn't get enough of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, just the bottom line. I just had an all new appreciation of the Bible and God's work among people, and what He wants us to know.
I know that that's a concise synopsis of a long journey of probably thinking through a lot of theological issues.
Yes.
Has it affected, the first thing that comes to mind when a person is hearing someone else talk about looking at the law, looking at the Torah, looking at the Tanakh, and that it shouldn't be left out, has it changed your view of, and I'm going to use the Christian term, grace?
Well, I've come to see the law as part of grace. And, in Romans, Paul says, without the law, we were without sin. And a lot of people misunderstand that. Mm-hmm. Sin existed, and people died in their sin. Mm-hmm. And people would have continued to die in their sin, but through God's grace, He revealed the law so that we would know we were in sin. Mm-hmm. That's grace.
Right.
That really is grace. And So the law is not an enemy of grace. The law is complementary.
I totally agree 100%. It's almost like, can you imagine operating your vehicle without any street signs?
Yes.
I mean, that would be, it'd be complete chaos, and you definitely end up in a crash with other motorists around. So it's nuts to think that we don't need boundaries.
Right.
And we understand that because you and I have been in this movement looking through this for a long time. In the 5 seminaries I've been connected to over the years, not one of them truly connected the student to the full story and the connectivity between testaments
Right.
that I was involved with. Now, I did end up going to a yeshiva for many, many years, and that, of course, was the focus. But, it's a sad thing. For me, I think it's a sad thing that we can, even as a minister, I mean, having senior pastored for many churches for many years, and not truly understanding the change of paradigm and the Jewishness of Jesus,
Right.
Yeshua. You look with a filtered lens when you're looking at Jesus, when you're looking at the apostles, that what it means to be a disciple. I mean, you want to go through the list when you're looking through the miracles, when you're looking through the teachings, the connectivity of the teachings to, where those concepts originally came from and where Jesus is referring to in the Tanakh. I mean, it's a complete, there's a void, there's a chasm between the two. And I think as post-Reformational Protestants, we fill that gap in with dispensationalism.
Yes.
So it's our own filter, and we filter wrong.
And supersessionism and replacement theology. After my journey, or since my journey began, I can see this everywhere in typical, denominations. It's just, it makes me want to jump up and say, no, like when I hear it going on in a sermon or something. Of course, I don't do that, but
No, why don't you do that?
well, because I'm in the middle of a big sermon, with hundreds of people around.
And it would be disrespectful.
Yes.
Right. It would be superseding the authority that God has placed within that congregation.
Right.
Whether you agree or not, whether they're right or not,
Yes.
that's not the place to do that. But to pull the brother aside, if it got to that point,
Right.
would be a better way of handling that.
And same thing when I read, when I read articles or textbooks or things like that. In those cases, I have actually written to the author.
Good for you.
And I haven't necessarily gotten responses, but I have before. I mean, I don't always get a response.
Sure.
But I will occasionally get a response, and that can begin a discussion, but usually it doesn't really change a lot of people's minds if they're an author already.
I was just looking at we're kind of all over the board on this, but I was just looking at an article about the National Council of Churches that they have just recently, again, stood behind the BDS movement. And, you want to talk about the BDS movement a little bit?
Well, if only people realize where it originated. I mean, it definitely originated with radical Palestinians here in America. I don't know a whole lot of the history about it, but I know that it is radical Palestinianism, and they're mainly hitting the big universities first, but from there it filters down, and then other organizations, will ratify that by not fighting against it. So,
In the same way that we're seeing in the political arena, a very lopsided way of reporting. And I don't want to date the show, but as we're filming this, it's the first part of 2019. So everybody is kind of aware of this chasm between Democrats and Republicans right
Yes.
now. It's huge, and we could really talk about that. I'd love to talk about that, but we'll do that off camera.
Yeah.
Okay, but for the sake of viewership, there's also this big chasm between the way things are being reported and allowed to be discussed within these large universities you're talking about. So you hear very little about pro-Israeli conversations, defending the land, defending their rights to be in the land. But you hear a lot about, them being the ones who've taken over the West Bank and subverting the Gazans to a life of captivity. And these things are all very lopsided, very unbalanced. You want to comment on that?
Well, also, in those universities, the Jewish students and people who are supporting the Jewish state and Zionism in general, this isn't reported in mainstream media, but they're being attacked physically.
Yes.
And they're being, hounded out of the university altogether in some cases. It is encouraging, though, that is being countered, from our current administration. They're beginning to make noise about that.
Mm-hmm.
And there are legal battles taking place that I've heard of in California on some of the campuses, where they're actually filing charges against people that are disrupting meetings. Big crowds are kind of barging in on meetings that are taking place
Yes.
and just causing it to stop.
Right.
And those people, the campus police, didn't do anything about it. So the lawsuit actually goes around those campus police departments straight into the civil law system, and they're getting some relief from that.
Good.
It's new. It's kind of in its infancy.
I hope it makes a difference. I've
Yeah.
spoken to too many national speakers that when they go, and they're conservative, and when they go in to speak at these universities, it's impossible for them to continue even speaking because the rudeness. What happened to people just with just the sense of what's fair, what's respectful toward one another?
And they go in with bullhorns into these meetings, and they get right up in people's faces and use these bullhorns, 1 foot from somebody's face. That's assault.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Okay, so theologically, you have been on a journey. In what areas has it really impacted you?
Well, I just love God the more that I know with what He's done, because this is not a surprise. He has revealed, what He's going to do with Messiah from the very beginning, and He didn't hold that back from us knowing about it. But we have to study it. We have to realize it. Something that I read that is considered in like Jewish circles is that the highest form of worship is actually study. And so, I mean, that's just been, ever since this has begun for me, like about 10 years now, since I rediscovered this, that's my focus. Like 3-4 hours a day is what I like to do as far as study. And, not every day of the last 10 years, but it's average, I would say, at least 2.5 to 3 hours.
That's phenomenal. It does say, right? Study to show yourself approved.
But it's just because it's just so interesting anymore. It didn't used to be that way. But as I go between the Testaments and just realize, wow, there's another connection that God has had there the whole time. And the more I see all the connections, the more I'm just amazed. There's no accidental words. There's no words like that in the Bible. That's not there intentionally.
I had written a commentary on Ephesians. It was the last book that I wrote. And up to this point, God willing, I'll have more time. But in this, I found, and it's exactly what you're talking about, that Paul's going through, Rav Shaul's going through, and he's talking, and he hits topic to topic to topic. And I began to wonder, why has he chosen these topics back to back? You know, they were very different from one another, but why that order? Because I think like you do, that everything is for a purpose. Everything has a reason behind it. It's not just random. And sure enough, he was quoting directly chapter after chapter, dealing with the one of the prophets.
Right.
And in the prophet's letter, he's going through, and one after the other, he's dealing with those topics, sharing that with the congregation and the believers in Ephesus.
You know, one of the things that I think is not well enough known is that the Gentiles, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, but they weren't just any old dumb Gentiles. They were God-fearers. They had already been plugged into for the most part, to the Jewish synagogues, the Jewish Messianic synagogues, wherever he had visited. Well, they weren't Messianic when he first visited them, but he plugged in. He would always plug into a Jewish synagogue wherever he went first. He would visit with the Jews as well as the God-fearing Gentiles. Oftentimes, the Jews would agree in total. The whole synagogue would basically agree with him. And other times they would not, and there would be a split. And the split would usually involve some of the Jews and most of the Gentiles, most of the God-fearers. They would, in some cases, move just right next door, you know, or they would go begin meeting in someone's house. But in all cases, they were familiar with the Jewish, the Torah. And a lot of people talk about the Council of Acts in Acts 15, Acts 15:20, where the decision was made that they should be taught. But what about Acts 15:21? Are you familiar with that? Do you remember that? Because it sort of, a lot of people just kind of gloss over that.
Right.
But what he says is, what the Apostle James says, is after all, they have Torah every Sabbath.
Right. Moses is taught.
Yeah.
All the cities.
And so people don't really understand that. They've been, ever since the people came back from Babylon, the Torah portions were taught every week. And so the Gentiles were already familiar with Torah. James and the other apostles didn't feel like they needed to reiterate Torah to the Gentiles. They only needed to specify what that was required of them to live in their pagan culture.
Right.
And so that to me, that's a very overlooked part of the decision there.
I agree. There's a lot that we take for granted. And, you know, we can argue, it's argued oftentimes out of the absence of something being said.
Right.
But the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, the newer or the renewed covenant, is built upon a predecessor. And to remove the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah, is to tear down the entire structure and all the comments that are being built and the idea of a Messiah in the first place.
Yes.
It's ripping all that apart. There's no reason to have a Messiah without the Torah. Not really theologically, there isn't a reason. Why would you have a Messiah if there isn't a problem in the very beginning?
Well, Paul complimented the Bereans because they went to the scriptures and tried to prove everything that he said. And in those days, the scriptures was the Tanakh, the Torah. So they weren't referring to the New Testament. There wasn't
Right.
one at that time.
That's right.
So
On this journey of rightly placing the Torah, the Tanakh, when we say Torah, we're not typically, when that's being said, we're not just talking about the 5 books. We're talking about the entire Tanakh,
yes,
the prophets, the writings. We're talking about the whole Megillah. It's interesting where that term came from, right? So it's a Jewish term. So anyways, this whole package that God has put together, we're really seeing then the New Testament, I think, about 2 primary things. One is it details the life of the Messiah that the prophets spoke about. Secondarily, it helps those that were not, and there's probably 3, but it helps those that were not brought up in a Jewish home understand how to live in a Jewish life as a Gentile and to put everything in the proper perspective. So it's kind of really a commentary, not just to the Gentiles, of course, but it helps reiterate these main principles. But it does not supersede them.
Right. Well, when I was very new in my journey, I decided to read the Bible. And nobody wanted me to or made me do it. I just said, well, what am I going to do? I need to buy kind of a new one that I can understand. So I did that. And unlike a lot of people, I read the introduction, and I read that in every Bible. But so I like to understand, what their philosophies are in interpretation and things like this. But I've never skipped the Old Testament when I've read the Bible. Uh, uh, and there are a lot of Bible plans out there that sort of skip around, like different parts of the Bible.
Right.
I never do that. I never have done that. I've always just read it from start to finish. And I have read different translations. I really have never read one twice. And so I always try to, but the more I read through different translations, the more I remember how other translations treated something. And the more I do it, the more I can catch it really quick.
And what are some of the things that you see that the translations don't emphasize enough or de-emphasize?
Well, one of the things that I've kind of noticed a lot is the adoption. There are some translations that don't even hardly use the word adoption. Like when we are saved or born again, we actually are adopted into sonship. And I think that's a very important concept, but some translations don't emphasize that. And I thought, well, why do they do that? And I've just kind of begun to notice that. There's just the way that they will treat, just the way they treat the law. Like Paul is very difficult to understand. Peter says so.
Right.
And
that's the first century.
Yeah. Yeah. And because in one paragraph, he can mention the law 5 or 6 times, and he's referring to 4 or 5 different laws.
That's right.
Kinds of law.
That's right.
And so and he doesn't specify, you just have to really understand Paul,
Right.
his entire his entire set of books to know where he's coming from. And and you have to kind of know the Old Testament besides, because if you just read the New Testament, you won't really understand what law he's talking about.
And I would say amen, amen, and also add on to that when a person is reading their New Testament, usually, most likely, they're reading from a translation from the Greek. There's a problem when it comes to the law in the Greek, because nomos is the term that they normally used. And that translates, I think, at least 15 different Hebrew terms. So to think that it's always law because it's the term nomos, which we just read in English as law, we're instantly thinking the Torah. And that is not the case at all. And I believe I'm underestimating. I think it's more than 15 different Hebrew words. And so all of a sudden, it's building within the reader, the English reader, this concept, and usually a negative idea of the Torah.
Yeah. Well, that's just been taught, and it's something that has to be overcome, and it's beginning to. I think it is very interesting that in the late 19th century in Poland, there was a movement among Jews to become Messianic, where they were becoming Messianic, and you probably know this. And it was
Liechtenstein was one of those, right?
And Hitler came along in time to basically put a stop to that. And that wasn't necessarily all of Hitler's doings, of course. That was a satanic thing. Because one of the main things that would bring about the end times would be full conversion of the Jews. And so I think that was recognized, and somebody wanted to put a stop to that. So,
Delitzsch was a huge name as well in that time period. And Kyle and Delitzsch, of course, is one of the great commentaries on the Tanakh, on the Old Testament. And but Delitzsch was a strong messianic believer.
and he translated the New Testament into Hebrew. I don't know where he translated it from the Greek.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes they did that. There was also another early translation into Hebrew that oftentimes that they look at. My perspective is a little bit different, even though I see the beauty of that and the work, the effort is monumentous. But I usually refer to the Aramaic text, the Peshitta text, and to me, it's a better land bridge between. But that's me. And these guys are brilliant scholars.
Well, I haven't done that yet, but I've heard of that, and I plan on studying that as well.
Well, these are concepts that are not just fun to talk about. These are life-changing concepts. Haven't they been for you? I mean, the looking at things from a Jewish perspective, which, by the way, we have to remember, these are Hebrews and Jews that have written these books,
Right.
or those that are proselytes that have been brought into that plan. So it just,
Well, the New Testament, all the books of the New Testament were written to people who really were, more so than we are today, very familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. So the Jews or the audience of that time, they were very familiar with the Jewish scriptures. It was their life. They knew it, if not for memory, they knew it very well. So when somebody was addressing a letter to them, it was not new, and it was very familiar with what they were familiar with. A lot of people talk about the letters being corrective in nature. Well, we might assume that these were the first letters or the first introduction to Christian theology that the audience received, but Paul had already visited these places for a long period of time.
Right.
They already knew way more than what the books of the epistles that he wrote
Right.
discussed.
right.
So he was not, he didn't need to revisit every single thing that he had ever visited
Exactly.
with them.
And that is so important.
Yeah.
Scott, we have so much more we can talk about. Let's do this again.
Sure.
And let's get back into the topic of the importance of understanding the scriptures from a Jewish perspective and where this has taken you on some specific theological issues. Thank you so much for watching the interview and being a part of Israel TV Network. We so appreciate you. We couldn't do it without you. We appreciate your prayer support and supporting those shows that are so vital and important for the whole world to be able to see. Scott, good to have you on the show.
Thank you, Rick.
And we're going to do it again next week.
Okay.
Okay, we'll see you then. Shalom, shalom.